All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Toolbox Tuesday on developing equity tools. My name is Anita Au, Senior Regional Planner at Skag, and I will be facilitating today's session. So Jennifer Martinez will be joining us today to help with any and all AV related needs. So if we have any issues with the chat, mic, or anything, she will be the person that we go to. So at this time, we'd like to encourage you to type your name, organization, and pronouns in the chat feature. This will help us know who's in the room as well as ensure that this feature is functioning for you. And lastly, closed captioning is provided at this meeting. So you can click on live transcript at the bottom of the menu and choose show subtitles to get that going. So now on this slide before you, you'll see a handful of housekeeping items. This workshop is anticipated to run for an hour and a half, and right now all participant lines should be muted. If you do have a question during the presentations, please type it in the chat box. At the end of the two presentations, we will have time for some questions, and we will address the questions from the chat, but if you would like to verbally ask your question, you can also raise your hand during the Q&A session, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself. And lastly, this meeting is being recorded, so the recording of the session, the presentation slides, and any additional resources that we'll provide during the presentations will be available on the Skag website, and we'll send a link to everyone who has registered after the event. So we want to acknowledge that we are on the original lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kizh peoples, and how deeply the field of urban planning continues to engage with land. So we offer this acknowledgement as a first step to more conversations and actions that will support Indigenous communities in thriving. You can learn more about the native land map as shown here with the link provided in the chat. So we have two presentations today on equity tools from Skag as well as LA Metro. And then after that, we will have a 20-minute Q&A session where we will answer questions in the chat as well as live, and then wrap up with some announcements. So we do encourage you to type your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, so then we can try to address all of them during the Q&A session. So before we dive into the presentations, I do want to go over some objectives for today. You will leave the session learning more about what an equity tool is, how equity tools can be used, how to use different types of equity tools, and most importantly, how to develop an equity tool that fits the needs of your jurisdiction or organization to further advance and incorporate equity into your work. So to help kick things off, we'd like to get a sense of who's in the room and the amount of resources that's available for your equity work. And this will really help us move forward with the presentations. So there are two questions. The first question is, what community, jurisdiction, geography are you representing? Is it community, city, county, regional, state, or federal? And then there's a second question. If you scroll down, does your organization have resources dedicated directly to equity work? Yes, we have dedicated funds and or staff, which is great. Yes, but we are severely limited by funding and or staff. No, but I'm dedicating my own time, or no, I'm unable to dedicate significant time. So I'll give it a minute or two to get the responses. I see a few more responses trickling in, but we do have about 68% of responses in right now. All right, let's end the poll. So it looks like we have a good amount of regional staff as well as city and county staff. Very few federal, but also a small amount of community members. And then in terms of resources, um, uh, that's great that we have a lot of a third of participants have dedicated funding and or staff, and then 44% have limited funding and or staff, and we will definitely address that in our presentations. And then a few don't have resources, but you're dedicating your time, so that's fantastic. And we have about 8% of you that are unable to dedicate significant time. And we hope that these presentations will actually help that in a little way. So thank you. All right. So without further ado, let's get on to the presentations. So I will be presenting on Skag's Racial Equity Toolkit along with my colleagues Anika Van Il and Annalie Ekman. And this session actually builds on the first two Equity in Action Toolbox Tuesdays, developing a baseline conditions report, which assesses existing conditions, and conducting meaningful community outreach, which further understands the concerns of your communities. So now that we've had those two considerations on board, we move on to how to develop a useful equity tool for your jurisdiction or organization. But before we can start thinking about developing a tool, here are some questions to consider. Does your jurisdiction or organization need to develop an equity tool? Is adapting an existing tool an option, especially for groups that have limited to no dedicated funding or staff for equity efforts? Is a tool, audience, who is the audience of the tool? Is it internal or external? What tools will be useful for your jurisdiction or organization? And then when and where can we actually use these tools? So these are definitely things to consider before actually diving into developing a tool. But a big question is, what is an equity tool? It's both a process and a product. So an equity tool can identify clear goals and objectives and measurable outcomes. It can engage community in decision-making processes. It can develop mechanisms for successful implementation and evaluation of impacts. It can identify who will benefit or be burdened by a given decision. It can examine potential unintended consequences of a decision and develop strategies to advance racial equity and mitigate unintended negative consequences. Or it can also proactively seek to eliminate inequities and advance equity. So there's a lot packed into the equity tools. So why did Skag build a racial equity tool? As you may already know, Skag adopted its first ever racial equity early action plan in May of 2021, and the plan includes goals and actions to help further racial equity in the Skag region. To encourage racial equity in local planning, Skag staff developed the Racial Equity Toolkit to integrate the explicit consideration of racial equity in plans, policies, practices, programs, and budgets. So I want to note that these tools are currently in draft form and for internal use only. But when these tools are more finalized, we are more than happy to share them with those who are interested so they can use it as resource or adapt these tools to your jurisdiction's needs. And so we understand that this process is very difficult, and Skag wants to be a resource to anyone who is dedicated to advancing racial equity. So on to our process. Our process to develop our internal racial equity toolkit was carried out in 4 main phases: research, development and review, case studies and pilot projects, and then finally training and next steps, which we are currently in right now. So through these 4 phases, we wanted to ensure that the racial equity tools that we created help incorporate, monitor, and advance racial equity in Skag's work. And as I mentioned before, this is an internal toolkit, but we're open to sharing our research as well as the draft toolkit for others to use as a resource. like first steps for many different projects, we started with research. So we started off with a literature review of existing racial equity tools from other agencies in our region, state, and nationwide. We aim to learn how different jurisdictions approached and implemented their tools. And a really, really great resource is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, GARE. They provided a solid basis for defining the purpose and structure of a racial equity tool and some of the primary questions to be considered at each step of a project, which GARE actually breaks down into 6 steps listed on this slide right now. And we'll drop in the GARE's racial equity toolkit it's already dropped in the chat right now. All right. So we also had the chance to sit down with 4 agencies and discuss their experiences developing and implementing equity tools, including the City of Portland's Office of Equity and Human Rights, the California Office of Planning and Research, the City of Long Beach Office of Equity, and Oregon Metro. Whoops. All right, so the links, oh, it went too far, sorry. I think my slides are lagging a little bit. Okay, so so here are some examples of equity toolkits. For the City of Long Beach, they applied an equity lens throughout their toolkit and developed 9 specific task-specific tools in which each tool had a set of questions, resources, and case studies to demonstrate how the tool could be applied. And then another example is from the City of Portland, where their Office of Equity and Human Rights developed a tool that supported their citywide racial equity goals and strategies. And this 7-step tool actually promoted a continuous, circular, iterative, and encompassing process that helped other departments develop their own tools to incorporate equity into their work, like the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, which they developed a tool that supported their decision-making processes. And with all that research, we actually started developing the tools, and I'll hand it off to Anika to continue the presentation.
So next, we built on this foundational research as we began to develop our own racial equity tool. So we initially started by developing the racial equity tool, building off the foundation of GARE's model. This was a simple set of questions that could be applied to any project. However, after working through a sample case study for a grant funding program, we quickly realized that within our own work at Skag, a set of tools or a toolkit aimed at different aspects of the planning process would be much more useful. We pivoted to developing 6 tools, which I will highlight in a moment. We do want to note, though, that although Skag developed a toolkit, these tools can be adapted from existing tools. In your work, your jurisdiction may choose to adapt an existing tool, like GARE's, or use it just as is, rather than developing your own. This requires much less resources and provides a great starting point for integrating equity tools into your work. So we had multiple rounds of internal reviews, both within our core team and our internal equity work group. The development of the RET was, and still is, iterative. The tools are designed to be continuously refined to make them as useful and helpful as possible for staff. So now I'm going to share some highlights from the 6 tools that we've currently been in the throes of developing. So our first tool, the equity assessment, is meant to help project teams, go back a slide. I think mine's also maybe a little bit lagging. There we go. So the equity assessment tool is meant to help project teams assess historical context and potential disparities associated with the project. The equity assessment is best applied to projects in the project planning phase as they go through scope development to make sure the appropriate scope items like budget, timing, etc., are included. So next we have the stakeholder analysis tool. The stakeholder analysis tool aims to assess who the relevant stakeholders and partners are and ask how they'll be meaningfully engaged throughout the project, throughout both the planning, implementation, and evaluation processes. The tool walks the user through the stakeholder identification, prioritization of those stakeholders, and then developing an engagement strategy. As you can see, a sample question is highlighted on that slide before you. And then on the bottom here, you can see a prioritization matrix that helps prioritize which stakeholders to engage with during your engagement process and how. So next, we have the data gathering and analysis tool, which helps staff evaluate methodologies used to collect and analyze their data. We emphasize some data best practices, like making sure you actually understand where your data comes from, in order to then ask questions like, what are the existing data gaps? And can that data be further disaggregated? Overall, the tool strives to ensure that data is complementing community knowledge and experience. In our work at Skag, we often wrestle with the inflexibility of data. And we know many of you likely do as well. So next we have the equitable strategy and action tool. This is a set of questions that helps users populate tables, like the one pictured on this slide, in order to think through how each stakeholder might benefit or be burdened by a project, and then how strategies might be shaped to address these equity issues. We also ask staff to consider questions like, how effective are the proposed strategies at improving equity? To make sure that we're considering the value of some strategies over others at reaching a project equity goals. It's lagging a little bit, sorry about that. The stakeholder communications tool, another tool that we have in our toolbox, is a tool that encourages inclusive messaging. Let's go back one slide. Let's see if it'll work for me. Hopefully it will jump back. Also, if you lose me, it does say that my internet connection is unstable. So if we have any issues, that will be why. Let's see. Okay, if we continue to have issues, maybe I'll ask Jennifer to help advance. But for now, I think we're okay. Yeah, I can turn off my video. That is a great suggestion. So this stakeholder communications tool is a tool that encourages inclusive messaging across Skag communications, including graphics, language, non-visual, and others, to ensure that all people are heard, informed, and engaged. The tool includes questions such as, does the budget include appropriate funding for written translation or oral interpretation services? This tool is really meant to be used whenever a user is reaching out to any stakeholder or providing communications and outreach materials. And lastly here, we have the community engagement and relationship building tool. This tool aims to engage the communities impacted by a project using equitable engagement methods to allow for strategic, meaningful relationship buildings that will improve the overall project and community outcomes. So on the right, you can see here a glimpse of this tool regarding event logistics and asking if the location is safe, accessible, respectful to all participants. And it covers checkpoints such as tribal lands, ADA accessibility, neutrality of the space, parking access, and the consideration of multiple locations. So I just did a very quick dive of the 6 tools in our toolbox. And now I'm going to turn this over to you for a poll question. What types of tools would be most useful in your work or agency? If Jennifer, you want to launch that, perfect. I'll give you all maybe a moment, a minute or two to fill out this question. And if there are other types of tools that would be of use to you, please put that in the chat, or ones that you've seen have been particularly useful. please add that to the chat. We'd love to hear from you. So results are coming in. Right now are kind of two in the lead here, although all of them have quite a lot of engagement and interest. I see here we have community engagement tools and data collection and analysis tools are the two highest right now. I think they're about tied. Give you all maybe 30 seconds more. Let's see if any more responses come in. I think we may have stalled on out, so we'll give you 5 more seconds and we'll wrap up the poll. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I will share the results with all of you. So hopefully you can see these. You see that we have community engagement tools and data collection and analysis tools as our two leading areas of interest, but it looks like just about all these tools have quite a lot of interest, which was similar to how we were at Skag. Also see that Darren put in the chat, tools to assess the transportation project's potential to support equity goals. Definitely that is an area of interest. I think the equitable strategy and action tool that we presented on is a great one that can really help with that space. I also see Sue Champion said that data collection analysis tools would be helpful as well to measure these equity outcomes and decision-making processes. Now, I'm going to take us into our third step of our equity tool process. Case studies and pilot projects. The third step, case studies and pilot projects, involved a series of testing and feedback from Skag staff that really allowed the RET team to develop a set of case studies and get one-on-one feedback from different staff members. The RET team initially identified 5 Skag staff members to test the tool. We chose these staff based on the types of projects that we knew that they worked on and how their subject areas matched the various tools. For example, we selected an economist as a key tool user for the data gathering and analysis tool. The key tool users were asked first to review the tool and then attempt to use that tool in their own work. After conducting these initial meetings, we also asked if there were other projects that they think could benefit from the tool that they had just used. Very quickly, that group of 5 staff members grew to 18. So we had all this valuable feedback on the content of the tools, but the function and the user experience of the toolkit still needed work. We also recognized that we needed to provide staff with concrete examples of how to use each of the tools. We planned and held 9 small group testing sessions where we invited product teams to walk through an entire tool with the guidance of one of the RET core team members. A total of 7 projects were tested. However, some projects wanted to check in again and continue the conversation in a second session. The key part of this testing was that we asked a member of the project team to fill out the tool so that we could test the user experience and make note of what did and didn't work within the document. This resulted in a new discussion for the RET core team to find a platform that allowed users to save and revisit the tools rather than filling out the tool once and never coming back to it. Some of the feedback we got from staff included the need to clearly define some of the language and terminology used, such as the phrase cluster analysis. In addition, staff pointed out that some of the questions were framed in the negative rather than from a strengths-based perspective. Staff also voiced that there were too many questions. Some were irrelevant or repetitive. And overall, some of the tools simply had too much scrolling, which was very fair. Some of them were quite long. Looked for opportunities to shorten each of these tools. And then finally, Staff provided suggestions for where these tools could be useful within their own work or more generally here at Skag. I'll pass it off to Annalie to walk us through step 4 of our process.
Thanks, Anika. We are currently working on what we feel is the final step of developing our racial equity toolkit, which is centered on training and distribution of the toolkit. There we go. We're planning for 2 trainings. The first is a racial equity toolkit champion training, where we'll go into depth into questions of the 6 tools and using case study examples from small group testing so that we can illustrate how the tool can be used and what kinds of discussions can be had. The second training is a shorter departmental training meant to introduce the racial equity toolkit to anyone who has not had the opportunity to hear about it yet or put their hands on it. And it's also meant to communicate the locations of these resources should they like to reference them, and identify contacts of the racial equity toolkit champions and the core team that helped develop the tool so they can reach out with any questions. And speaking of Anika, Anita and I, along with our colleague Leslie Caton and Courtney Aguirre, are the core team who developed these tools and this toolkit. And we will provide continued support by making ourselves available to answer questions and can help staff through consultation. We'll be providing user guides and like one-pager cheat sheets for when to use the tool. And we'll be providing recordings of the 2 trainings so that anyone can reference them. And then, of course, storing everything in one place so that staff can easily access them. So going back to this, going back to racial equity toolkit champions, we wanted to provide an overview of what that would mean to be a champion and how we're selecting them. So the current list of RET champions comes from an open invitation to anyone who's been involved in our internal equity work group and or on the development of the racial equity toolkits for key tool users and anyone who was part of the user testing. And will ideally represent someone from each department in this planning division. We wanted to make it very clear to our champions that what was expected from them. So that's shown here on the slide under the 4 items, which includes attending the trainings we just discussed, maintaining a working knowledge of the racial equity toolkit, and being able to identify a starting place for a project that might want to use the racial equity toolkit, and also being able to locate equity resources in case they don't have an immediate answer for them. We also want our racial equity toolkit champions to be advocates of incorporating equity into all programs. And one way that they can do that is through being a source of knowledge and meeting with project teams to discuss equity concepts and walk through the racial equity toolkit if needed. And finally, we're asking our RET champions to help us communicate where the resources is stored and to communicate any future updates to their respective departments. And so since we've been working on this racial equity toolkit for about 9 months now, we have some lessons learned that might be helpful for anyone who's looking to build their own racial equity toolkit. First, as is true with equity work in general, the development of this toolkit is an iterative and messy process. We presented 4 well-defined steps to take, but in truth, steps 1 through 3 all sort of happen at once and in overlapping stages. So we're looking forward to continuing to edit these tools as more staff are exposed to them and have feedback on them. The second lesson learned is that we needed to define an audience for our tools to help frame the questions. And our audience for this toolkit is staff specifically in Skag's planning division. We've coordinated with staff in other divisions like our HR team and our public affairs team, but primarily these tools are oriented towards project managers and their teams in planning. It was important for us to recognize that our audience wasn't the general public. Our tool uses planning jargon and is specific about the program management processes at Skag. And by being specific, we can start to identify and disrupt our own structural inequities. Basically, bouldering down anything that is holding us back from doing equitable work. And this final point is about, being able to be specific about our audience allowed us to be specific with our questions, which is why we decided to build on the GARE tool and create these 6 tools. It wasn't palatable for our staff to be going through 10 pages of questions, so we divided it up. It allowed it to be still be specific about asking specific questions, but aimed towards different phases and elements of a project. And then finally, we, as we mentioned earlier, we interviewed agencies who had already done this type of work and wanted to share some of the lessons learned from them. And we can now, confirm some of those lessons based on our own experience, which is first, that all agencies agreed, and Skag agrees too, that implementation of racial equity toolkit is difficult, even when staff are on board and enthusiastic about considering racial equity in their everyday work. We also learned that some agencies wanted their staff to grow out of the need to depend on a toolkit. Their intent was that that staff learns and can apply new practices and thought processes to the point where they eventually don't need the toolkit at all. It is that cultural shift from learning and plus the policy change and leadership buy-in that are crucial here. We were reminded by each agency that realizing equitable outcomes doesn't depend on the tool itself, but the ability for staff to see and seize opportunities. There were differing opinions on whether on the value of quantifying and recording the use of racial equity tools. On one hand, documenting responses might be helpful for future users to learn from past experiences, while some agencies thought that this emphasized the wrong aspect of why the tool exists. The tool itself is not the product, but it helps us step towards reaching more equitable outcomes. Skag has settled on not quantifying the use of the tool, although we hope to keep some of the documentation so that we can learn from our coworkers and keep records of what types of engagement are happening, what's innovative, what are people thinking about. And finally, we've found that there's some amazing tools that already exist that are shared publicly by agencies. I know that we've dropped the links to some in the chat already. So you don't have to go through the whole process of making your own tool to implement something like this. I think equity tools are something individuals can use and just apply to their own work, and address some of the potential biases that might be held and make positive changes as a result. So now that we've shared a little bit more about equity tools, I'm going to launch into another poll to see, where have you landed in terms of your experience with tools and thoughts on maybe developing a tool or adapting an existing tool. What would you like to do with equity tools, or do you need to learn more about equity tools? That would be, we want to, know where you're landing. And if none of these 4 statements apply to you, maybe you aren't feeling anything like this, feel free to add your thoughts into the chat. We'd love to hear directly from you too. It looks like we have around 50% participation so far, but answers are still coming in. And it looks like only one answer so far is for my organization already uses a tool like this. Seems like most people maybe haven't used a tool like this yet, and would be able to know if that tool has been useful for your organization as well. Looks like the responses have slowed down a bit, so we'll keep it open for 5 more seconds. And Warren, I see your question in the chat. We have a Q&A session coming up after we have our presentation. So we'll adjust that then, but for now you can see the results of the poll. Most people are interested in adapting an existing tool, which is great. We'd love to share again our own Skag's own tool when it's ready. It's currently in like draft form, but happy to share that with everyone as we finalize it. And so yeah, this wraps up Skags process of developing a racial equity toolkit. And we want to support you as you work to advance the equity. And we know it can be challenging. So any way that Skag can help you and your teams, either by sharing our tool or advice on developing our tool, we'd be happy to share more. So I will hand it back to Anita.
Thank you, Annalie and Anika, for presenting on Skag's racial equity tool and toolkit. And so now that you've heard about Skag's racial equity toolkit, I'd like to introduce Keandra Seiler Dodds, the Executive Officer of the Office of Equity and Race at LA Metro, to present on LA Metro's equity tools. So welcome, Keandra, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anita. Okay, can you put up the slides, please? And good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Keandra Kyler Dodds. I lead the Office of Equity and Race at LA Metro, and I'm going to share with you some details about Metro's Rapid Equity Assessment. It's one of 3 tools that we currently have. One which is very similar to what we just heard from Skag, but I'll explain a bit about the how and the why we developed the Rapid Equity Assessment, details on the tool itself, including going into the questions, and then how it's used today and lessons learned from our process and the implementation. Okay. So I always like to just share a little bit of background about our equity work, which formally began with the equity platform. Our equity platform is approved by Metro's board in early 2018. The core objective is to increase access to opportunities, including jobs, housing, healthcare, and general mobility and the freedom for all to move. It recognizes that there are vast disparities that exist in people's ability to access opportunities across LA County, and it's really intended to help identify and implement projects and programs that reduce and ultimately eliminate those disparities. It stands on 4 pillars. Those pillars are listed here. I'll very briefly go over each one. The define and measure pillar really focuses on defining equity, measuring disparities, and then identifying communities that are in need of greater mobility investments. Listen and learn focuses on listening and learning from the communities that we serve and incorporating their needs into our work so that we're better able to serve them. Focus and deliver focuses on our processes and also the tools that we have to help us deliver more equitable outcomes. And finally, the train and grow pillar focuses on Metro and its employees to ensure that we have an inclusive working culture, that staff diversity reflects the broader community, and that our staff is trained as equity fluent leaders to help advance equity through all that we do. So we also, just briefly, we have our definition of equity. So for Metro, equity is defined as both an outcome and a process to address disparities to ensure fair and just access to opportunities. Our focus is on outcomes and ensuring equal access to the things that people need to live full and healthy lives. Equal access is about the outcome, but the input, what we provide, the services, has to be equitable to meet people where they are. And so that's why the process matters as much as the outcomes do, because that's where we start to understand what are existing disparities, what are people's different starting points, and then and what are the barriers that prevent them from achieving full and healthy lives. And importantly, we have to ask why, because that helps us to understand how we then create solutions or improvements that help increase access to opportunities. All right, so Metro has 3 equity tools. The first is our Metro Budget Equity Assessment. The second, our Metro Equity Planning and Evaluation tool. But today, I'm really going to focus on the Rapid Equity Assessment. And I'll share a little bit more about the other 2 at the end of the presentation, because I think it helps to understand kind of the context in which we use all of them and at each of them at different times. Okay, so to give a little bit more context on the history of the Rapid Equity Assessment, it was established in June 2020. Now, I joined Metro in January of 2020. That's when my office was established. The first COVID-19 stay-at-home order was issued in March 2020, and in late May 2020, protests began in response to the murdering of George Floyd. So as I'm sure many of you all recall, in the first 6 months of 2020, the world was drastically changing, and our agency was tasked with responding to and addressing challenging and changing situations every day. And even though we had our equity platform, which charged us to really make those decisions in a more equitable way, we didn't have the tools or the guidance to really help us to be able to apply that equity lens to our decisions. And so that's why we created the Rapid Equity Assessment and launched it in June of 2020. It was developed initially to help us apply an equity lens to emergency decisions or quick decisions. And it was developed to provide a simple set of questions to help staff understand the impact of their decisions on marginalized communities and others more likely to be impacted by COVID-19, and particularly how to maximize benefits and reduce negative impacts. It's evolved over time to allow for broader and more effective use throughout our different decision-making points. Next. And before I dive into the tool questions, I did want to share a little bit about other tools and other work that inspired our development of the Rapid Equity Assessment. So this picture is a slide from a presentation from the city of San Antonio. It provides a helpful framework for thinking about equity during emergencies. And we were particularly inspired by statements number 1 and 5, the first of which says, equity-based decisions can be fast if the right people are in the room. And then the 5th one is racial and economic equity is still our priority. If equity is your only priority in times of ease and surplus, then it was never really your priority. And so we took a lot of this to heart, and we really looked to the city of San Antonio, but also the city of Denver, who were developing tools that could support their decision-making in a time of crises and help apply an equity lens. And so we, of course, had to adjust to make it fit our needs as a transportation agency and think about the decisions we were making. But that's a little background on what helped us and what was part of our research developing this tool. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to dive into the tool questions. But at the beginning of the assessment, one thing that we ask all folks that submit or that complete the Rapid Equity Assessment is to just describe the action that's the subject of the assessment. So at the beginning, there's a little summary, and then there's 7 questions, and I'll walk through each one briefly. The first question is, will the decision being made impact any of the following groups? And will the impact be employee or public facing? And so we have a list of potential groups that it might impact: Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color, low-income households, people with disabilities, what we call our equity-focused communities, which is defined, it's geographic designation that's defined by race, income, and lack of car ownership. And then there's a category for other marginalized groups or those facing disparities, including people with limited English proficiency, LGBTQ, members of the LGBTQ plus community, women, and older adults. And then lastly, we also have an option to consider minority or women-owned businesses, or disadvantaged businesses, or disabled veterans businesses. The second question asks you to dive a little bit deeper and to consider who will benefit from this decision. And are there barriers that will prevent some from benefiting from this decision, including their physical ability, the affordability of the program. And it asks you just to explain what those benefits are. It's important to dive kind of deep and explain rather than just selecting those groups and not providing detail. The next question Who may be harmed or burdened by this decision, even if unintentional? So this might include certain users of a particular service. It might be people that live within a project area, or others that are somehow impacted. So between these first three questions, we're really asking people to consider how are different people experience whatever the action is, whether it's a service change or provision of a certain program, or a new policy. Next question. Okay, so this one asks, how will this improve equity outcomes? And are there any positive impacts for marginalized or vulnerable groups, including the ones listed above? And then will this reduce negative impacts? So again, this is thinking about the end goal, the outcomes, what's going to be the impact. The fifth question asks, what are your strategies to mitigate any potential negative consequences of this decision? And then we try to give a little bit of example to help people think about it, but we ask, please include specific examples related to community engagement, messaging, outreach. And if the impacts or if the mitigation opportunities are unknown right now, we ask folks to revisit the tool if there are unintended negative consequences that occur. The next question, sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, is what community engagement and data informed your rapid equity assessment, and how will you proceed to ensure equitable outcomes? So this is actually, our tool has evolved, and this is one of the newer questions, but we really wanted to make sure that people, even though people were moving, the tool was created initially for emergencies, and when we didn't necessarily have the benefit of time to engage communities as we would normally like, we wanted to make sure that as we evolved and adjusted the tool and started using it more broadly, that we really focused on who are we engaging and how are we considering their input and their partnership in whatever actions we're supporting. And then also importantly, really looking at data, but not just the everyday data that we normally use, thinking about what is the right data to help us understand the impacts of our work. Is it disaggregated? How are we able to identify any disparities if they exist? And then being able to use that data to think about the impact of our future action on its ability to change outcomes. And then the last question is really more of a process question. And I'll talk a little bit more about the basis for this one, but the question just it has you summarize the impacts of your action, including basically everything from questions 1 through 6, and then you use this summary for any report or board report or other document explaining your decision or recommendation. And so this is, let's see. Okay, so while the tool is called the Rapid Equity Assessment, clearly it does take some time, some research, and sometimes adjustments to the action or the future plans that this is assessing. It can be more quickly completed by a group of folks with different backgrounds and experience, working together to think through the questions. And again, the final note, this question right here brings us to how the tool is used today. So that's the next slide. Okay, so while developed during COVID for emergency decisions, today the Rapid Equity Assessment is used for many other processes and decision points. During July, with the leadership of our new CEO, Metro initiated an equity platform section requirement for all of our board reports. So that means each report that goes before our board of directors must be assessed for equity impacts, which are then summarized in the report. Staff are to use our rapid equity assessment as a guiding tool. And then my team reviews all board reports and works with teams to think through impacts, address concerns, and then each report must be approved by our team in order to move forward in the process. We look for things like, has this submission demonstrated what the benefits are rather than just stated there are benefits? Have they utilized disaggregated data? Are there details about who was engaged and how, amongst other things? Again, issues have to be addressed in order to move forward in the board review process. And this requirement has really expanded Metro staff capacity to effectively use this tool with the new requirement, more and more are starting to use it and finding it helpful, and now also starting to use it in other decision-making processes, even when it's not required. So it's been really effective, and we're seeing a lot of growth throughout the agency in folks' ability to really understand what is being asked in these questions and then to apply it to their work. Now, so outside of the board review process, other examples of places where this tool is being used include in brainstorming and kind of exploratory phases of work when people are thinking about new projects or new policies. It's also become kind of just a general default tool when our other two tools are not the most useful. So our other two tools, one applies to the budget. So if it's a non-budgetary item, it might utilize this. And then the other tool applies to capital projects or major initiative. So outside of that, those two categories, the rapid equity assessment is more broadly used. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I forgot to keep advancing the slides. Okay. So a little bit more about the other tools before I start to wrap up. But so as I mentioned earlier, we have two of the tools. One is the Metro Budget Equity Assessment, which we call the MBEAT. The MBEAT is used during the budget development process. It was our first tool that we implemented agency-wide through a required process back in November of 2021. It has, 2020. It has questions that are similar to the rapid equity assessment, but they're adjusted to really focus on the unique aspects of our budget requests and our budget development process. And so those submissions are actually scored and then used to help assess and prioritize budgetary decisions internally. Lastly, there is the equity planning and evaluation tool. Sorry, the order. Okay, and lastly, there's an equity planning and evaluation tool, which we're in the piloting phase of. So this provides guidance to help ensure more equitable project development, like capital project development processes and implementation that will ultimately lead to more equitable outcomes. It's actually very similar, again, to the GARE Racial Equity Toolkit and also the combination of the 6 tools that Skag has provided. So I'm looking forward to being able to dive in more deeply into the Skag tools and see what we can learn from there. The EPET, as we also call it, it's the most complex and substantive of the 3 tools, as it's meant to really assist staff in a process it's grounded in what we have understood to be results-based accountability, and that as a model. And so we start from the outcomes we want to see in the community, and then we work our way backwards into the project or the solutions that really support those community outcomes in a more equitable manner. And so it takes a particularly deeper dive into the data analysis part of our work, and also community engagement, amongst other things. Next slide. Okay, and so I wanted to end with just a few lessons learned from our work, both developing the tool and also applying it over the last year, actually. And so training is key, both on equity generally, what is equity, what is your definition of equity, but also on the history of inequities that currently exist and have existed over time. And then also what inequities or equity can look like in our work. I think one of the things that I've learned is Metro is so large in its scope and size, and also in its scope. You know, we cover everything from bus and rail, which we operate, to real estate. We own land and there's development on that land. And we partner with other jurisdictions on things like active transportation, and also have a program addressing homelessness. So our programs and our scope are just so broad that it's important to make sure that there's specific training opportunities, one-on-one meetings that allow different staff throughout the agency to really understand how these questions apply to their work. And some of that just takes time and investing the training into that process. Another lesson learned is that tools can evolve. And for us, they should. You know, part of the reason that our tool has evolved is to help make the questions more clear, to make sure that the tool is effective given our processes, and to adjust for things that we were missing in the first version. And it's those type of improvements are, you know, help with the process, right? And then in addition to improvements directly to the tool, we've also created other resources along the way to help people better understand the tool and better be able to apply it. So that includes glossaries of terms. There's some terms that were just new to some of our staff. They've never really had to ask these questions and apply it to their work. And so we've been working on things to help them with that. Trainings and different, which are recorded, and also creating a series of maps to help people think through the geographic implications of their work. It's also helpful to have an equity, truly a toolkit, right? A suite of tools that helps advance equity. We have 3 tools that support our broad scope of work, and they share some similarities, but they're also specific to the unique processes they apply to. And then we also have tools to help support more inclusive and targeted community engagement. We're still developing tools, and so there's more to come on that, but it's important to have a combination of things that can help your agencies. And let's see, then there's the internal buy-in, which is really, really critical. Now, when we first developed the rapid equity assessment, we had support from our leadership, but there wasn't a requirement to use the tool. And so in the beginning, it wasn't as well or broadly used as it was intended. Now, with the initiation of our board report equity requirements, we've seen much more use because it's required, and more buy-in because people actually, once they start to use it, they see that it's very helpful and it's not as challenging as it seems right away. It's definitely, I agree, you know, applying these tools, especially in the beginning, is challenging. And it's especially, I mean, it's new for many people, but the more we practice and the more it becomes part of our work, the easier it gets. And then one of our goals is also that we don't necessarily need these tools moving forward. And then I did just want to mention before I wrap up, I do think that whatever tool you use has to be effective, it has to be tailored to your agency. And I think it's super helpful to be able to see what other tools other agencies have. And that's one of the things we've done, right? We utilize kind of a combination of elements from different tools from other jurisdictions and other organizations, but we tailored it to our unique needs as a transportation agency. And really having folks that lead that process just do their research and make sure they're fully understanding of how it applies and what you're asking and what's the intent behind it, and also what your users need to be able to effectively use the tool. So I just want to end on that lesson learned for us, and that concludes my presentation, and happy to take any questions. I'm going to turn it back over to, I think, Anit, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Keandra. And now with both presentations concluded, we can start our Q&A session. We actually got a few questions in the chat. So I'm gonna, I see a question, or I see a hand raised. So maybe we'll answer that question or ask that question first, and then we'll go back to the chat questions. So Sarah?
Hi, Sarah Ruscone here. I'm with a public agency in Los Angeles that does open space preservation and public access to natural lands and park development. You know, I am our first environmental equity officer, and equity has a lot of different components, including internal and external. As far as how we better serve the public and our communities in which we work, I'm curious, how did you develop a policy related to translation, what materials you translate and in what languages, and what determined those factors for both Metro and Skag?
Keandra, you want to tackle that first?
Sure, I will answer to the best of my ability. So we actually had a policy on translation before I started at Metro. So I don't fully know the history of how we developed that policy, but I do know that we're currently looking at how do we expand, especially in kind of a time where so many of our meetings are virtual, right? And so we've been able to utilize tools like Zoom and other kind of virtual platforms where there's the option to have simultaneous translation. And that was something that we switched to, because before we had people call in and there was a little bit of a delay between what they heard and on the phone. So we've been looking at our processes of integrating translation into our new kind of engagement platforms, more so within the last 2 years than we have creating the policy. Happy to share the policy. I can get more information about the details of the policy, but I can't really speak to how it was developed because it was before my time. But yeah, happy to follow up. Very familiar with MRCA. So feel free. I can put my email in the chat if you want to follow up on that question.
Thanks, Keandra. And I mean, so similar with Skag, we have specific requirements on providing translation services for different meetings and workshops, and the languages that that are chosen for each meeting and event will depend on like the location that that the meeting or workshop is at. Like for if we were to go to Orange County, we would have Vietnamese would be maybe a language that we would include in the options to provide to attendees. But in terms of how that kind of comes about, it depends on each situation. But again, also I'm happy to talk more about that offline. Great. So I think we have a few questions in the chat. So I'm gonna start with the first ones that I saw, and then we'll move down from there. So this is kind of a question that was adapted from Dr. Rumala's comment on suggestions of how jurisdictions can get started when they're at the very beginning of their equity work. So do we have any recommendations of what they can do? And maybe I'll start, and then Keandra, you can respond. So for us, I think there's a lot of equity work out there already. So for our process, we started with the research, and I think that was really, really important because number one, we got to see what was out there, what was already developed, and how we can actually utilize the existing efforts from other agencies and organizations to help cater to our needs. And that was definitely something that we mentioned in the presentation. And for jurisdictions that are just starting out, we are more than happy to share our research with you as well, because there's just so much out there, and there's a lot of great information that that you can utilize instead of reinventing the wheel and having to develop your own tool all by yourself.
In my recommendation, I would say bring in support, bring in experts to help. I mean, GARE is definitely a resource. There's different consultants that are doing great work in the space right now. There, obviously, Skag is another, great expert. Bring in experts, and also make sure that you resource the work, right? So having dedicated staff, it's hard when you have staff that it's not necessarily part of their regular job. And so in some circumstances, if it's not clear that it's a part of their job, they might be, torn and stretched between doing all the things that are within their role, and then equity work being kind of on the side, which is not effective when you're trying to create a program and you're trying to figure out how to move the agency in a different direction, right? And so it's really helpful to have a team that can dedicate their time and then work with folks throughout the agency whose day job this is, it's incorporated into, but may not be their main focus. It's important to have both. So yeah, I'd say between bringing in experts and making sure to provide some resources for the work, those are some tips I have for starting the process.
Thank you so much, Keandra. Next, we have a question from Warren. Any thoughts you have to share about how it is changing decision-making processes at Skag, or other outcomes that you want to share? I think this could be both for Skag and LA Metro in terms of like how the tools are actually impacting our work. So at least for Skag, we are still trying to release the tool, so we don't have that information yet. But based on our case studies and pilot projects, we are talking to staff and getting them to walk through the different tools. And then there are some instances where they're already applying a kind of a equity thought into the process that wasn't like explicitly clear to them until they actually went through the process. Whereas areas where they were answering a question and they didn't even consider incorporating equity into it. So then we're hoping that these tools will actually be able to incorporate equity into their work on a daily basis. And eventually, as Annalie mentioned, that we want these tools to we want people to not use these tools and actually have be second nature to actually just incorporate equity into their everyday work. Keandra, if you want to follow up on that.
Happy to. I think for Metro, we're, and it's actually been more than a year because it's June 2020. So it's been a while, I guess a year and a half since we've been implementing the tool. And I think I've seen impact in a couple different ways. One, of course, through our board report process. Having to ask these questions has opened up just a ton of new conversations about all aspects of our work that some folks didn't necessarily, you don't think about equity when you're thinking about part replacements for bus, but we have those conversations. We think, okay, well, it's replacing the parts, but the ultimate goal is to maintain the bus, maintain the service for the end user. So kind of helping people kind of think through things like that, and then to think, are there ways that how are we applying this this part replacement process? Is it in a way that, okay, we have the resources and we just do all the buses at one time? No, we don't necessarily have all the resources to be able to do that. So then how do we prioritize? And what other things do we consider as we're implementing and ordering these parts and then replacing and prioritizing? So it's been really interesting to expand the use of the tool beyond kind of parts of the agency that we typically, it comes a little bit more natural, like our joint development or other work, and it's opened new opportunities. And I think the last thing I'll say is it's also helped us with planning some different programs. We use this tool to help us think through an Adopt a Bike program that we created recently, where people leave or lose their bikes on our system all the time. We maintain them for 90 days as required, and then we used to auction them off. But now we actually collect them. We work with CBOs to distribute them to communities that are in need of more mobility options. And we use the tool to think about, how do we prioritize those communities? What other considerations do we need to have in addition to the program? Bike safety training, just kind of other considerations like that. So it's been useful both as we think through our decisions and also as we plan new programs.
Thanks so much, Keandra. It's great to hear how the tools are actually impacting LA Metro's work. So we have another question in the chat from Denise. Do you have an anticipated timeline for Skag's tools or toolkit to be finalized? Interested in more of the sample questions. So I think we're anticipating doing trainings in February and March, but we are open to providing the draft toolkits to anyone who's interested in taking a deeper dive into what our tools look like, but just a caveat that it is in draft form. So Denise, if you are interested, please reach out and we can work on that for you. And then another question from Finn, that's for you, Keandra. She's interested in learning why LA Metro didn't call it racial equity.
That's a great question. I think, so one, I'll say so my office is the Office of Equity and Race. We do lead with race in our equity work. But I think part of building the tool, we have many discussions around it. I think as long as the tool really prioritized and led with race in its considerations throughout the tool, we also wanted to make it clear, because sometimes we did receive questions of, oh, does your office just do racial equity or do you do other things? We wanted to make it clear that we're leading with race, but we're also looking at other equity issues, including issues for people with disabilities, income-based inequities, et cetera. And so that was one of the reasons we decided to, but it doesn't mean we have any less focus on race at all. In fact, again, we lead with race in all of our development of equity tools, our equity focused communities definition, and other equity work at the agency. So.
Thank you, Keandra. We have next question is I think that's for Skag. So Corwin asked if you could please give us more information about the case studies and pilot projects. So this, I'm actually going to let Annalie or Anika take this on for a little bit. So either one want to go ahead?
Let Annalie take this question.
Sure. I guess we talked about how we put together, I think it was 7 different pilot projects, basically reaching out to staff within Skag and searching for, areas where we could start to use these tools. So we went through a little bit of an exploratory, like how we're gonna structure this feedback so that we're not trying to do like 7 different processes at the same time. But ultimately what it looked like was we met with the project managers and their teams. We as the RET core team met with them in a meeting and went through one of the tools, one that was relevant to their current work and felt compelling to them. And we went through, I think it was like an hour-long meeting of just going through each of the questions, getting to like test out the conversations that could be had with the tools. And I think maybe we didn't get to like directly say this in our presentation, but the tools as they've been practiced have really been, brainstorming sessions and like thought-provoking conversations. Like the questions are meant to make you think about things that you haven't thought about before, maybe. Or if you have, it's meant to, like concretely state that. So those case studies sort of opened up, oh, maybe this would be applicable in another project, or I'm working on something that this would be helpful in. So those case studies sort of opened up more areas that we could test the tools. So I don't know, maybe if the kinds of information that you want to know about the case studies. I guess I could share that we've tested them out. So I work on the Environmental Justice Technical Report for the RTP-SES, the Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy for Skag, which involves, 18 indicators. It involves a lot of data. So we, as the EJ team, Anita leads this, we talked through the data gathering and analysis tool. How can we source data equitably? Are we thinking about all of the, this is environmental justice, so it's already has such a like racial equity focus on it, but are we doing it in a process in a manner that that thinks through every single community in this? So that's one example of one of the pilot projects that we've used. Sorry, that was long. Anything to add from Anita or Anika?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add a little bit too, because during our case studies and pilot projects phase, we actually looked at different projects where we could apply the tools at the beginning of the project, middle, and at the end as kind of like a lessons learned type of situation. So we could see how the tools can be impactful at each different stage of the project, and we found that it was definitely useful in any stage of project, depending on the type of tool that we were trying to apply. I hope that answers your question, Corwin, but if you have further questions on that, please feel free to contact us. All right, so I hope I'm not going too fast on the questions, but next question is from Jenny, who this question is more towards Keandra. She's looking for some staff board reports that use the toolkit, but she's not really finding anything. So is that something that's available online?
Yeah, so I can share with you. So the board reports, you won't see the completed assessment, you'll see the summary, because it would be much too long to include all of that. So I'm happy to share if you send me an email and you're interested in a few board reports that have it. I'm happy to share some of those. But again, they started with our board process in July. So we have about, what is this, January, about 7 months of reports that now have those sections. So just, yeah, reach out and I can share some of those with you.
Thank you so much, Keandra. We have, I think, one more question in the chat, unless I'm missing any, but I will scroll back. So this question is from Laura. I am working with the Ventura County League of Women's Voters, who have established a social justice and racial equity committee. I am the only woman of color on the committee. What tools are available to help educate those unfamiliar with racial injustice? Is there a checklist of things that we should consider? So Keandra, would you like to tackle that first? It's a hard question.
It is a hard question, mostly because I think that's part of the challenge with our work, right? We often get asked this at our agency. You know, some folks, they're interested, or they're like, oh, I got to do this requirement. Give me a checklist. Give me the, like, what do I have to do? And we don't have checklists for every situation, right? Sometimes it's context specific. It depends on the community. It depends on the project. And so I think as far as starting to learn and educate folks about racial justice and equity broadly, I would say, and I missed a little bit at the beginning of the question, so I don't know if you're with a government agency, but utilizing resources that already exist to learn more, right? We've mentioned GARE. They have a lot of resources that are great, but they also have webinars with people from other cities and experts in the field, practitioners, community members that have been doing this work for years. And so I think it's helpful to not, reinvent the wheel, but to really learn from best practices and existing experts that are out there. There are tons of webinars, books, articles. We actually have a group, I don't think I mentioned this, but we have a group of Metro staff that we call our equity liaisons. And part of their job is to do that education, right? So we train them, they learn, we read books together, watch videos, have discussions. And then they also help us with the tools, kind of testing them out, piloting them, and supporting their departments and using the tools. But there's tons of resources that exist. Oh, that's a great link. The Race Forward has a lot of good content, and I believe that's the entity that I guess owns GARE. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. I'm sure Skag has more recommendations.
No, you actually touched on a lot of things that I wanted to say. I think that training and looking through the resources, getting that education is a big step to getting a same grounds and understanding before you move forward to actually try to develop goals, policies, and actions for your organization. And I do want to maybe go back to looking at our previous Equity in Action Toolbox Tuesday sessions, where you also want to assess the existing conditions of the either jurisdiction that you are representing or the organization that you are advocating for. You want to know what exactly are the concerns, so you can be well educated to actually advocate for the appropriate levels of equity that you need to move forward with. So it's definitely a lot of work, and it's very hard to start out, especially if you are at the beginning. But again, as Keandra mentioned, there are a lot of resources that can help you. But I think it's that the commitment to advancing equity is very, very important.
If I might just add one more thing.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Just, our Metro, we've really been intentionally and formally focused on equity since 2018. So we're, I guess, in our path. I would maybe not a toddler, maybe we're getting older, but still, it's important to have these conversations. These are it's got to be an iterative process of education and these discussions and making sure our leadership, our staff, that we all have and develop this shared understanding. I say that to say, even if I know, it's harder in the beginning, but it's something that we have to continue to practice, especially as things change, as we better understand existing conditions and history. And it just takes time, and we have to continue to work on it, continue to work on educating ourselves and having these discussions. So I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Keandra. That's a great point. I think I have gone through all the questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised. Are there any other questions that participants you want to ask before we move on to our wrap up?
I think, Anita, there is one more question in the chat
okay.
About what are the metrics used to determine Vietnamese.
Oh yeah, well, I think I addressed it in the chat.
Sorry,
I didn't mention it, but so the example that I provided for Orange County having Vietnamese translation, it was actually just an example that we actually did in a previous workshop at Skag, but I should have mentioned that we usually utilize demographic information to inform these decisions, because we had other translation languages at other workshops in other counties or in other communities that were different as well. So yes. And scrolling some more. Okay, I don't see anything anymore. So thank you so much, Keandra, for your wonderful presentation and for answering everyone's questions. I hope this will gives you some insight as to how we develop and or adapt equity tools. So you bring this back to your organizations and jurisdictions, and maybe we'll start seeing more tools pop up. So Jennifer, can you go to the last slide deck, please? Oh, and yes, the presentations will be posted on the Toolbox Tuesday website. So we'll provide that link to everyone when it is available. And it'll be for all the participants that registered online. Great, so now we're done with our Q&A session. So I do want to thank everyone for participating in today's Toolbox Tuesday. And we want to encourage everyone to consider participating in our upcoming Equity Working Group meeting, which is on Thursday, March 24th, where we're going to talk about a community engagement toolkit. We're going to talk about our equity resource guide, as well as kick off our 2024 Connect SoCal efforts. And please don't leave yet. I'm seeing some people are starting to leave, but we want to launch one more poll just so that we can get some information on what we can do for our next Toolbox Tuesday. So the tool has launched already. So what additional resources or Toolbox Tuesday trainings could be helpful for you? So these are all equity related, as we're doing our Equity in Action series. But this will inform us as to how to plan our next sessions. I'll give it a few more seconds. Actually, we do have 4 minutes, so I think we are good on time. But we have about 60% people answering, and it looks like we're looking at equity action plans and equity indicators or performance measures that are most interest to people, and then followed by some equity definitions and goals and equity frameworks. Oh, and outreach is also climbing up there with 44%. So I think we've stopped getting responses, so I will end the poll. But so this will definitely help inform us as to what the next Toolbox Tuesday session will be on. So thank you everyone for participating in this poll. Next, apologize for all this, but we do have a quick 2-minute survey that you can use the QR code here, or it will actually direct you to a link after the meeting closes to help us improve any future Toolbox Tuesday sessions. And this is including other Toolbox Tuesdays, not just the Equity in Action series. So if you could please take the quick 2-minute survey, that we would greatly appreciate it. And then we also have these additional resources here. And we're hoping that you can use these for to further your equity efforts and to help develop or adapt any equity tools that you are considering to make, or you are already in the process of doing the research on. So with 2 minutes to spare, I can't believe we finished on time, but thank you so much everyone for participating in today's Toolbox Tuesday on developing equity tools. And again, thank you, Keandra, for your presentation on LA Metro's equity tools. We are very happy that you joined us, and we hope that you stay safe and healthy. And we will have our next Equity in Action Toolbox Tuesday in April. The topic will be determined soon. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.